Great Wednesday. Welcome to the Healing America's Narratives podcast. I'm your host, King, and I'm joined by my co-host, Reggie. How you doing today, Reggie?
Doing well, King. Good to be with you here on a Wednesday morning on what we call, Thanksgiving Eve here in the United States. And you and I will get into our gratitude moments in a moment or two. But I'm looking forward to jumping in and engaging with before you ask, my 10 out of 10 spiritual energy.
Okay. All right. Well, I got a new question I want to add to the understanding and listening aspect of connecting, and that is, tell me something good.
What are you, crazy? No. um, I'll say something personal. I'm going to give you two. One personal, one bigger picture. So the personal one is I have this ongoing problem with this one tooth where I had a crown put on, and it's still giving me pain. And I've had conversations with the dentist, and he's going to go back in and replace the crown, and because I didn't have pain before the crown, now I have it after, and he's just doing the right thing. Just he's going to replace it, and no charge, because he the sequence of events is such. So he didn't make me like beg or anything. I just asked him what the charge can be. He said no charge. I need to fix what's causing the pain because you didn't have it before we did this. So that's one. That just kind of gives me faith, because it's not always the case in the healthcare environment.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then the second one is there's just more and more things happening in the larger national picture where the court system is working in various ways, where a judge threw out the retribution cases brought by Donald Trump and Pam Bondi against both Comey, the FBI director, and James, the Attorney General of New York. So it seems as though the wheels of the rule of law turn slowly, they do turn, and there are still a lot of good people out there who believe in the rule of law and applying it equally to all people, even though there are some people who don't do that. So those are two things that I'm aware of right now.
All right.
I hope they meet the standard.
Hey, no judgment on the standard. It's whatever you feel is good is happening that you want to share. That's what I want to hear. I'm a 10 with you. I vibrate in a 10 a day, mainly because of my gratitude moment, which as I go into that is my life. I'm grateful for my hearing, my ability to see, walk, talk, stand, breathe, and have a sound mind. Another 24 hours to pursue my purpose in life. For the problems that I have in my life, the challenges, because through the solution to those challenges presents, and I gain wisdom from that. Mm-hmm. Also, I'm grateful for the opportunity to continue learning every single day. It's like that's a blessing, and that's where the sound mind comes into play and the self-awareness to realize and recognize that I am learning and what I don't know, and continue to keep adding information to my life and being able to discern what information do I allow into my life as well. And finally, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here with you on this podcast, and looking forward to our conversation. How about yours?
Yeah, so as always, thank you for that. And as always, I'm grateful for my, the structure within which I dwell, especially this time of year where it's been cold and kind of raw for, a couple of weeks now, and I have heat in this house and a roof over my head and windows to keep the elements out, food in the refrigerator, indoor plumbing, and so all of my basic needs are met. And I don't take any of those lightly. Expanding out a little bit further, I get to do what I care to do to make my living. I get up every day. Another way to say it is I do what I think is important, as opposed to what an employer wants me to do on behalf of the employer's organization or institution. And that's not a diss of people who have built things or who run organizations. It's just that this ability to really focus in on what I most deeply care about, especially at this point in my life, is important to me, and I get to do that every day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And with that being said, that's great. Why don't we walk us into our topic for today?
Yeah. So, for over 3 years now, we've been speaking about Healing America's Narratives, which is the title of my 2022 book. And we've gone through the content of the book. We've begun applying the concepts in the book to current events. Again, we've been doing that for over 3 years. And what we're going to begin today is to slightly tweak how we do that. And this comes from a suggestion made last week by one of us, who was not me, that we're going to kind of split the show, not exactly in half, but begin it pointing to an issue, one aspect of the shadow of the country that many millions of Americans still don't own or recognize. And then we're going to work moving the second half of the program, to the aspects of becoming more fully human, or how do we heal from these shadow elements. So specifically, the shadow element that we're going to point to today, and you can see that up on the screen. Thank you, King, for doing that. Is something that I didn't know about until within the last month or so. And in the fight against enslavement in this country, and we all know about the Civil War, and we know about the debates during the Constitutional Convention, and we know about the 3/5 Compromise, and we know that many of the founders compromised in order to keep the southern states in the Union and to get them to ratify the Constitution. They don't mention the word slavery. They use some euphemisms in the Constitution to refer to people being imported, is how they say it. That's not a direct quote, but it's close. And what I didn't realize were the many petitions. And petitions were a big deal even before the Declaration of Independence and before the Constitution. And again, the Declaration was 1776, the Constitution was 1787, 88 when it was finally ratified, and then the Bill of Rights came in, I believe, in 1789. But there were thousands of petitions that people would send in to their state legislatures and to the Constitutional Convention. And to cut to the chase, and anybody who's viewing this can look at this now, what we're going to focus on today were petitions, and there are 4 of them on this page. You can see the first one, part of the second one. Petitions sent usually to a state legislative body before the United States of America officially existed with a constitution. In this case, the first one, even before there was a Declaration of Independence, petitions sent by enslaved Black men. And I'm being specific now to use the word man because they were signed by men. Even in their petitions, it wasn't clear if they thought that women were going to become free people or not. And I'm not saying that they didn't think that. I'm saying it's not clear in the language, even in a petition sent by the Quakers of Pennsylvania in 1688 against slavery. The language isn't clear that women were equal, but it is clear both with the Quakers in the 1600s and in these enslaved Black men in the 1700s, several petitions before the Declaration of Independence was even signed, petitioning to be treated as free men because God created all men equally. So that's what we're looking at here. It's in front of us. I'm going to stop and open it up to your thoughts on this.
Well, my initial thoughts are, I want to thank you for choosing such a worthy topic and even turning me on to this. I wasn't aware of, never heard of petitions against slavery and things of that nature. So, and being informed about this and learning about it has really been eye-opening to me, and definitely continue to reinforce the resilience of people who were enslaved and how they were able, and they were fighting back. And you hear stories about them fighting back, because that's pretty much been omitted out of the history books that I've learned from. So I definitely appreciate that, and you sharing that, and then actually being able to read some of the petitions. And as you said, maybe not necessarily being the best English, and they didn't care about that. What they cared about was really getting their voice heard and really getting their position shared. And then what also showed me the human connections of the whites who supported that and who helped them, aided them in creating these petitions and submitting them. So I just really found that really fascinating. And again, other examples of what I really want to say as I scroll through this page. What doesn't get talked about enough throughout history is basically the humanity that was shown from the abolitionists, from whites who showed enslaved people at that time humanity, and then helped them to fight to get their humanity, even at great peril to themselves. And what I find to be interesting is how that's not really discussed on either side, and I know that's done intentionally. To see more people learned about folks who actually, I mean, I've heard about abolitionists, and we probably can name 2 or 3 that we were taught about in school, and that's pretty much about it. And I think most people nowadays, I'm sure, if I ask kids, I'm some Generation Z's and millennial, do they know what abolitionists are? And I'm pretty sure they probably won't know, because it doesn't get talked about in our common zeitgeist at all. They don't even get recognized. And I mention that because it's a humanity that we need to tap into now in order to really begin to start working together and understanding that we all, through a quantum level, are connected to each other. And it's not a natural state in nature to connect, engage, and begin to support one another. It's only because of our politics and our minds that we choose not to, and we believe in the separation. So just sharing that document with me, and you bring this discussion to the table, just reinforces that what I'm studying, and additional information that really helped me find pride in that period of my ancestors' time.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your saying that. I just want to dive in a little bit deeper. So since you and I spoke, I've gone and besides the online sources, I've gone and looked for some of the hard copy sources of some of these, and there's a lot more than would appear on the page we just shared. There was a book that came out, I believe, I'm going to say in the 1970s. Don't quote me on that because I don't have all the information in front of me. But it's edited by a gentleman named Herbert Aptheker, and we can share that maybe in another episode. But it's called A Documentary History of the Negro People in the United States. And in the first 10 pages or so of volume 1, it's a multi-volume book. In the first 10 pages, there are many of these petitions from different places. I mean, Massachusetts and Connecticut and other places where the enslaved men themselves wrote asking for their freedom. And as you referred to, I mean, depending on the slaveholder, some of these enslaved peoples did or did not have access to reading. They didn't, they had to be taught to read because they weren't speaking English when they were in Africa, but they were surrounded by English-speaking people once they were enslaved. And so, what I really like about some of the documents is that it's evident that somebody showed them how to prepare a petition to send it to the government. that there was a formal way to do that. But they didn't cover up the fact that these people had never been really been given the benefit of education. So the spellings and syntax were a little bit off. So some are better than others. But even that little bit, it goes to show the devastation of how a life has changed from being with one's own family and people thousands of miles away across an ocean and being kidnapped and enslaved, by people who thought that was okay. In fact, one of the documents, one of those particular petitions, actually made me laugh, because one of them had written, I forget which one it is, basically, and again, they were writing to state legislatures in, the two I remember were Massachusetts and Connecticut, but there were other places as well, which were writing to Englishmen, basically. And they basically said, and we're really aware that unlike the Spanish, who don't care as much about freedom, we have a lot of respect for the English, who do care more about freedom. So they kind of just, and with all due respect to the people of Spain and Spanish speakers, in terms of, from Europe, the enslaved black men, felt that I don't know if they felt not fortunate, wouldn't be the right word, but they saw a difference between what the Spanish were doing and what the English were doing. So that was a fairly telling point in one of those petitions. But to your point, it gets back to something that we have these words on the frame of this podcast, Healing America's Narratives and Becoming More Fully Human, that it's not like nobody knew that enslavement was bad until the Civil War, in the years leading up to the Civil War in the 1850s and into the 1860s, and finally the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments passed post-Civil War. It's not like it was suddenly an awakening. There were many people who knew, they just weren't in power, and they weren't willing to challenge what became the southern states, the Confederacy, because gradually the northern states, who did have slaves, on their own began to end slavery well before the 13th Amendment, thus the fighting of the Civil War. So it was, in the language I use and what I wrote about in the book, again, the elements of the shadow that you and I have been speaking about there are 9 of them: ignorance, arrogance, fear, bigotry, violence, greed, excess, bullying, and untrustworthiness. And if you think about it, sometimes it's hard to tell in a given moment if somebody is ignorant, they really don't know any better. And if somebody is arrogant, they really do know better, but they're going to do the bad thing anyway. And whether the bad thing is bullying or enslavement or committing violence, whatever it is. Because the arguments made for enslavement in the United States leading up to the Civil War and leading up to the Constitution were basically about the economy. I would say there's ignorance, there's arrogance, and there's greed. We can't make money without slaves, and those people are slaves. They're not like us. They're not humans like us. So that's all the shadow stuff that, as we know in the 21st century, is not gone. Now, in the specifics of formal institution of enslavement, yeah, gone. But in the specifics of seeing others as subhuman, not gone. That still is happening now. And the work that we're going to do, in the second half of this podcast, is start to speak about those elements of what it means to become more fully human, and heal this shadow, which means recognize it exists, own that we all share parts of it, and then integrate it so we can become more whole, more fully human. So that's the direction that we're moving. And I'm just repeating that intention because this is the first time that we're actually going to more or less divide the show into 2 halves. in that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I want to make clear, because I know that some folks will interpret probably some of my comments and I'm going to say, and some of the things I write about, as you reference my Substack articles that I heard about, that when I talk about fully human and the need to adopt that as to escape free from the construct, to escape from construct thinking as a way of saying that another form of saying colorblind and, post-racial. And it's not, I'm fully human. We can still acknowledge the physical differences in historical past, present harm, which we are doing right now. So it's not colorblinding it. And it's not also saying we're post-racial and saying that racism is over and that we need to move in that kind of harmony type mindset. What I'm speaking of in particular is that what people don't realize is when they allow themselves to function within the construct, whether it's folks who feel superior in white supremacy or folks who want to have pride in their race because of the marginalization, i.e. black pride, that you still are operate within the construct and you still operate within the system of the construct, which is not in your best interest and it's not real. It's a physics violation. And so it is within that context that we explore fully human being, that we're looking at a way there. At the end of the day, we're all human beings. And if it wasn't for the system of white supremacy creating this division and creating the construct that we operate in, and I believe that if you're fighting within the construct, whether you're fighting for your race or you're fighting against another race, you are taking away your creativity, your divine nature to be as creative as you possibly can. And that's one of the main personal benefits and reasons why I advocate people should be or adopt a fully human identity and hop on that path of learning more about being fully human as you talk about. But also, I think it's integral to really understand the past. And I think your book, Healing America's Narratives, definitely helps people grasp an understanding of the atrocities that America has created in the name of establishing this country, and how many people have actually suffered and the violence, the horrific things that's been done to people. So we're not bypassing that or sugarcoating that at all. It's like we understand that, but that should not make you label every single person of a color the same and think that everybody's monolithic and hold everybody equally to their blame. And that's why these narratives that you're sharing, these declarations that you're sharing in today's conversation, just really, again, brings that back, that there was unity, that were people working together who saw humanity in the enslaved that we had never heard about. And that's why I really find it to be so fascinating, because not prior to knowing this information, I felt it in my soul. The more you study about being fully human and understanding it within myself, how, again, committing to being growth minded and realizing what you don't know. And for years, I've always heard about the bravery within my race, if I look at it within that construct. But like I said, it was just kind of lightly brushed. Well, yeah, it was abolitionists that helped out, and there was Underground Railroad, but these are the people you mainly want to lift up. And it's like, and I went with that because that was my cultural givens that you teach. And it felt easier to, when I'm looking at the victim role, to say, okay, with the victim lens, here's how my people survive and our strength. And yeah, it was some traffic directors on the way on the Underground Railroad, but pretty much that's all they really were, just directing traffic. Like, you can go here and I'll push you through this tunnel. And it's like, that's how they were talked about. And they played a much more significant role. And I believe that as we begin to really examine both sides, the understanding the atrocities on one side had to endure, and as well as the people who put their lives and liberty at stake in order to help those individuals, because they were human. They saw humanity there and nothing more than that. Now, yeah, friendships were developed after a while, but that was the reason for their coming together. That was the reason for those folks standing up and taking a stand. And that's the power that comes up when you adopt the fully human mindset.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I want to just say a little bit more about fully human, and I want to just mention our mutual friend, and whom I've known since 2011 now, Ken Frazier, because it was in work he and I were doing together that idea of becoming more fully human was language we began to use. We actually named a course around it, and one of the things that was interesting about it is we made a conscious decision not to say, okay, here's what it means to be fully human. Like, we never gave anybody a definition, so people. You know how I used to learn this way when I was a kid. Like, okay, you give me a concept, tell me what it means. Give me I want to know the definition so I understand it, right? So people would say, so when you say fully human, what do you really mean? And we would say, oh, well, good question. What do you think it means? So it's, if you do this, are you fully human? If you do that, are you fully human? If you have this trait, are you fully human? Because that's the funny part for me anyway. But what we were trying to understand ourselves and share with anybody that would take the class is that we didn't want to constrain or limit what it might mean. People get a sense of, more fully human. Nobody, well, I shouldn't say nobody. I haven't met anybody so far who feels constrained when they hear those three words. I haven't heard anybody that says, "Oh, that doesn't sound good." More fully human. Like, nobody does that. So, again, there might be some people like in or around Congress or the White House who would do that, but nobody I've actually met. And so, what we began to do in the classes, when somebody would mention something about their own shadow, something they saw about themselves that made them uncomfortable, and they would say something like, and I'm being very generic now because I can't remember the specific examples, but they would say something like, so this was really upsetting to me because I want to be more fully human. And what we gradually as a group began to realize was just that you recognize your shadow, that you understand that you were denying this thing, whatever it was, and you're no longer projecting it, or you're not projecting it as much onto other people. That in and of itself, even if you always have this trait for the rest of your life, maybe your initial response to meeting somebody new is to be judgmental. Let's just use that as I've heard that people actually do that. but just, so you're judgmental sometimes. And you recognize that. That means that's part of how you're fully human. Fully human doesn't mean you're a perfect person or good all the time. And if you're fully human, what does it mean to be fully human? It's not Jesus or Buddha, and not that any of them were perfect. I didn't know them personally, so I don't know. But it's taken the whole shebang. But just so we're clear, we're not saying, okay, so I can be a complete horse's ass, I can hurt people, and that's just part of how I'm fully human. No, because there's another piece to it. And King, you always say this, is being an ongoing learner, to being opened up to wanting to understand more deeply and more broadly. And that's what allows us to be more fully human. But it doesn't reject the things that we perceive as being negative or uncomfortable traits. If we are fully human, we're working to become more completely fully human. It doesn't mean we make believe that we're perfect. We own the shit as well as the good stuff. So that's like a broader view of the language that I just wanted to share, because that's how we began to navigate it. And to this day, I still don't think, like, trying to define it. If you are fully human, that means that you blah, blah, blah. Maybe something like you're open to ongoing development while recognizing your shortcomings. I mean, that's something like that maybe, but I still don't even think that's a good idea. So I want to just put that out there too, because you were really clear on how you've been using the language in your own growth and development and in the work you're doing, beyond what we do together. So I just wanted to give people my sense of how we use the language as well.
Right. And I think that's important because, that's the thing about being fully human from my perspective is that you can define it for you to where it makes sense for you, how you look at it. Because I agree with you. We in agreement that it's definitely not about being perfect. It's not something that you say, okay, because I'm fully human, I've reached a certain deity status and there's no imperfections in me. It's just understanding that there are, it's just the opposite. It's understand there are imperfections in you, but you have room to grow and learn from those.
Yeah.
And then again, you have the self awareness to understand your impact has the actions and your behaviors, the impact they have on the ecosystem, on your environment, your community, and the zeitgeist that we live in. Like, for example, um, just to make a point about people, and that's the world we live in nowadays with social media and the way people are taught to do social media is that everybody is trying to get your attention.
Hmm.
And so in order to get attention, you have to have the most, you know, your subject line of your email or your tagline of your podcast link has to be as sensational as possible for somebody to so let me click on this and read about what they're saying with all this other sensational stuff going on. And when you're trying to compete against someone like the president who does something pretty much idiotic every single day, it's hard to sit here and compete with someone who does that because the news cycles are going to, he calls someone Miss Piggy.
Yeah.
Right. So that's going to dominate the news cycles and everybody's going to pretty much talk about that. And so to try to get your voice out there in that noise and get someone to notice your article, your video, you look at someone like Megyn Kelly who can come out and try to justify Epstein uh, and define and then come up with a new definition for pedophiles. And to sit here and say, well, he didn't, someone close to me told me that he didn't really go for the young looking ones. He was really more so the ones who were older, but they were young, but they looked older, like the 14, 15s, are barely illegal. She uses the term barely illegal. And now she's an attorney, but she's going to create a term called barely illegal, right, to fit her narrative.
Yeah.
And again, that's just a complete crazy statement to make. And I really believe a lot of people on the right, in my opinion, just make these statements just to get attention. I don't really believe they really believe what they're saying. I believe they put their character on. And that is a part of humanity as well, as looking at people who decide to put on a mask and put on a character to make money. And then really understanding how that works in the system of things and not being able to sit here and get so caught up in and judging that and saying, well, that's so wrong, which I do believe is wrong, but then I see some of the atrocities on the other side. And you can talk about what's ego or not and, the false equivalencies. But when you're fully human and you're on that journey, and I look at it as a journey, as a destination, when you're on that journey, you hear and you see things as being part of the system, and you don't let yourself get triggered by saying, well, this one's against me, this one's against this certain group, this one's for that, this one I can accept. It's just all data. And how you process that data is where you are in your mental maturity continuum in your life and your direction.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just want to add this part, and that's where I feel comes into the shadow elements you talked about earlier. It's those understanding those 9 shadow elements and then beginning to be aware of or your behaviors in line with those shadow elements at certain moments within your day. I think that's the journey that I'm on now, is being aware of, am I exhibiting any shadow elements? When? What triggers me? How bad? What are my actions? Is being aware of that as I continue my growth.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and your comments about the attention, I don't think you said attention economy, but that's what it is, and how things are designed just to get and keep our attention, and how some folks realize, okay, I have this cash cow, I have this brand, and I have a visceral response. This might be just me getting old, but just the idea of the language of personal brand, which has been in our vernacular now for probably a couple of decades. I don't know exactly how long, but just that human beings, and I understand the marketing element of it, but people speak about, well, I got to be careful what I do so it doesn't impact my brand. And I want to say, okay, your business can have a brand, but you're a human being, and maybe you need to just see the difference between the two. But going back to Megyn Kelly and many others, man, if somebody, I think I know the answer to this, but I've never been in a position where somebody's paying me, a high 6 or 7 figures a year to speak or write or whatever it is. I got to guess that it's hard to, if you're used to that kind of lifestyle and income, and maybe it's hard to turn off that spigot. But it comes down then again to, who are you really, and what's your integrity, and especially for somebody who left Fox because of accusations that she and 2 other women made about sexual harassment at Fox News, to kind of play loose with, and again, we're not equating pedophilia with sexual harassment, but there's a thread that goes through both of them, and that's patriarchy and male supremacy, not necessarily white, but predominantly white. So it was especially surprising coming from a woman who had been subjected to sexual harassment on the job. But when it comes to the marketplace, if money is the primary motivator, it seems as though anything is possible. Even some of the places where I know I can get a good bit of reporting, and I'm not talking about like the New York Times online or the hard copy or the Atlantic, those type things, but some of the things that end up being shorts on YouTube or 8-minute report on YouTube, where I know the commentator has some level of integrity, and I might go there just to hear something. What they put up as the headline very often is so incredibly sensational and almost inaccurate just to get people to click on it.
Right.
Because in other words, once you get into the content has some value because it's thoughtful and it's based in reporting and research, but it's clickbait. They make it something ridiculous to really get your attention, and that's a shame because it speaks both to the people who think it's necessary to do that to get my attention, and then it speaks to those of us who will click on that unknowingly because it looks really cool, man. Because I want to see how they did whatever that headline was. And so it works in reverse now. When I see headlines I know are clickbait, even if it's some place that I would normally maybe go to get news or get a report or another opinion, I just ignore it now. So.
Well, see, that comes down to your critical thinking. And see, that's where I'm talking about, again, as we continue to discuss fully human. Once you begin to put yourself in a journey, you begin to critically think and look at information that's really what it is it's data. It's not meant to sit here and take it emotionally and put these emotional attachments to it. Like I use the reference like whack-a-mole. Like once you understand you're playing a game of whack-a-mole, you don't get mad because the moles pop out. You don't get mad and say, okay, I just hit him there, so he shouldn't pop up over here. You understand? This is the game I'm playing. So I'm playing whack-a-mole. I expect these moles to pop out. When you are understanding the game that's being played and how white supremacy, the system of white supremacy works, then you expect the Megyn Kellys to make these ridiculous statements. You expect, and that's the extreme on the right. But then you look at, like I was watching in a certain YouTube influencers I follow on YouTube give information that's pretty progressive. But then they'll themselves have a video thumbnail that says, Kash Patel, FBI director, fired, right? And then you click on that and it's no, he's not fired. They're just creating a story around that. And it's like, well, okay, now I just wasting my time. Again, that's clickbait. Yeah. This person was just as disingenuous to get my attention as Megyn Kelly was. Again, and what I'm saying is, yeah, you can argue, well, she's lying about this, or she's protecting, or she's trying to justify, but she's speaking to her base because that's what her brand tells her to do. And that's where her money comes from. Yeah. And that's what it is. And I'm not forgiving her. I'm just saying that's how I receive it. Just as on the left side, someone's doing the exact same thing. They're getting paid by MSN. They're getting paid by their Patreon members. They're getting paid by their base to create sensationalized stories. And they still understand that in order to compete, to get your attention, they got to come up with the most sensationalized headlines as possible. So to get you to click on that, and see, that to me is complete against my understanding of how to communicate and engage with individuals. I won't adopt those tactics because, again, I only want to build with people who I'm aligned with and who I'm vibrating on the same frequency with. So if I got to lie to get you to look at me, I got to scream fire in order to get you to get your attention. That's the next step that people are not doing. But that to me is just that extreme. If I got to scream that to get you to look at me, then your attention wasn't really warranted on my end anyway. And that's what I accept. So I need to create value to get your attention is where I'm going from. And to me, that's the journey of being fully human that I'm on, is how do I be a better person each and every single day and not focus on what I did in the past, other than that's a learning mistake, but how can I be much more kind, intentional, and serving going forward and connecting with the energy of love as much as I can, as often as I can throughout my day. Those are my quests within the fully human journey that I give. And I just want to wrap up by saying this, that unlike, I know you and Reggie felt it was important not to give a definition, and I get that. And I respect that. The engineer in me, though, I think in frameworks. To me, I have to have a framework. I have to have definitions, and I have to have these systems that I can begin to compare things and put things in and build a growth or a framework from that. I come up with 6 pillars, right? Because to me, I looked at it being fully human. Again, these are mine. This is not the definition for being fully human. But to your point, is each person creating their own. Right. And for me to learn, for me to grow, I realized it had to be 6 pillars, and I'll talk more about those later. But that to me is how I kind of fell into mine, because I think in systems and frameworks in that context.
Yeah, and I get that, and I don't disagree with that. In fact, one thing I want to say is I'm looking at where we are time-wise, and so we about halfway through. But by mentioning critical thinking and talking about love and the 6 pillars, we're moving now into that part of this podcast where we're talking about becoming more fully human and actually what that means and what people can do. I think it's fine, like, to put, okay, here's some things that would be included in being fully human, as opposed to this finite, discrete, cut and dried, 25-word definition. Like, fully human includes blah 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 blah, and it's open to add more when it does. So, but we pretty much agree on that, I think, anyway. So just to stay with that theme, in terms of we mentioned the shadow elements. So what do you do with that? What do you do with the shadow elements? If you want to become more fully human, if you recognize that it's not a perfect world, unless you're living in the mystical space and you see it from 50,000 feet or 50,000 miles, and you see that, in fact, if you take the universe and the whole space-time continue into consideration, there is a certain perfection in it, and it's just that we humans have made it much more difficult to navigate it because of how we treat each other. That's kind of like a joke, but not entirely a joke. So what are some of the things that we might do? So one of the questions, there are some questions I use in Healing America's Narratives, and I just have to put an asterisk here for a second because you mentioned whack-a-mole. So American Whack-a-Mole was one of the titles that I considered for Healing America's Narratives. It was American Whack-a-Mole, and then it was how the government, the media, and blah, 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 distract American, blah, 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 something like that. So that almost was, had it gone in that direction right now, rather than Healing America's Narratives, that might say American Whack-a-Mole up top. And but I say that because I really believe, and the people who are good at marketing that I know personally, Healing America's Narratives is what the book was about. It was accurate. But American Whack-a-Mole, with a good subtitle, would have gotten more attention.
Right.
From a marketing perspective. So, what was my intention, to put out a good book or to sell a lot of them? Yeah, I'm still learning that whole approach. But more specifically, questions like, who am I really? And we've gone through those probably a year and a half, 2 years ago. But who am I really? What am I missing? Everything is a story. Those are the type things that those of us who aspire toward a more fully human sense of ourselves, I would say, have to ask. I mean, what am I missing? They're all important. I used to try to play with which is the most important one, and I always landed on who am I really, because it kind of encompasses the rest, but they're all important. So anybody listening to this, if you're attracted to the idea of becoming more fully human, two things to consider, and they're not things you consider for 5 minutes and say, okay, that was a good exercise and I'm done. It's kind of a lifetime of exploration. Who am I really? And I won't get into the one way that most people answer that, but we can do that in maybe future episodes. And then two other ways that very few people respond to it. And what am I missing? In the current United States of America, if people would sincerely ask that question every day as they go about their lives, parenting, working, hanging out with friends, having political opinions, what am I missing? That is the developmental question. Because if we're honest about it, we're able to expand our view and see a more increasingly inclusive, comprehensive, balanced, and complex world. If I think I'm seeing everything, that's problematic, to put it lightly. So we have a bunch of directions we can go for the next 13 minutes or so. What do you think would be good?
Well, I think let's expand a little bit more on the who am I, because I think that and I want to reference a video that I recently saw, and Adam Watts talking about the voice in your head. I think most people believe that who they are is that voice in their head that gives them information. They think that's who they are. And like Alan Watts asked the question, if that's you, then you should be able to predict the next thought coming in your head. And the fact that you can't predict that next thought coming in your head shows that that's not you. But you're pretty much the observer of the person. You're receiving that information. That person in your head is more than just an advisor that you've now designated or given. They're advisor, but you've given them the keys to the castle. And you're following their direction. And all that advisor is nothing but someone who's programmed by your cultural givens. He uses the example of learning how to tie your shoe. And when you're teaching your kid how to tie a shoe, you have to teach them these steps. Okay, you first grab the two shoestrings, you cross them, you create a loop, and so on and so forth. And then the child begins to learn that process, and they even mentally go through that process while they're learning to tie the shoe until it gets into their unconscious mind, and they just do it without even thinking through the steps. It's there, right? That's how a lot of people are programmed by the media we're listening to. And so that's where the 1% understand the game, the 1% who truly play white supremacy and benefit from it the most, understand that if you control the voice that people hear in their heads, that's going to determine the action that they do, their behaviors. If it tells you that you're hungry and you may not necessarily want Burger King a day, but you keep seeing that Burger King commercial and as you rule and that keeps hitting you, eventually you're going to say, I'm hungry. Burger King, I rule. Now, you might not necessarily say it in your mind out loud, but those thoughts are connected and associated. I can rule if I go to Burger King and I'm going to get what I want. And then you're going to realize you're not getting anything that's healthy for you at all. You're just being controlled. So that's why I say that who you are and really understanding that. And I just want to conclude by saying this. What Alan Watts suggests is the fact that who you are truly is that quietness between the thought. That's who you are, and that's what you want to get to. You want to observe the thought. Wow, I just had a thought that all white people are bad. Where did that thought come from? Why did I have that thought? What influenced that thought? As you begin to start processing that kind of things in your head, then you realize, again, that's just information. And I don't necessarily have to go and make actions on that information. As a matter of fact, I can question the source and the logic of the information because I am who I really am, right? And that's why I believe that we should really focus on who you are as a great starting point for the rest of the show if you open for that.
Yeah. So I mean, so you're citing Alan Watts is kind of giving people a postgraduate school view of who they are before we get out of elementary school. But yeah, ultimately. So I'm not going to say no more about Alan Watts for now. But I want the vast majority of people, and I asked this question in classrooms with adults. I've done it with students. The vast majority of people respond through what I would refer to, and this is not my language, but it's the common language, what would be called a middle world. And that doesn't really mean a lot to a lot of people, unless you think of it as being between the underworld and the upper world. But more specifically, it means they respond from a psycho-social perspective. So they respond in ways that deal with their biology, with their psychology, and with their social roles. So typically people will tell you, the kids will say like, well, I'm the son of blah, 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 or I'm the daughter of blah, 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 blah. They'll name their parents. They'll tell you their age. They'll tell you what sports they play or what instruments they play or what job they have after school, or whatever. They'll give you, again, basic, accurate, concrete, day-to-day world descriptors of what they do, how they look, who they're related to. The adults do the same thing. They tend to lead with parenting and then jobs. So I'm a lawyer, I'm a nurse, I'm a carpenter, I'm a plumber, whatever it happens to be. And it's the conventional, again, middle world view, because we live in a culture that values that middle world. What's a good life? A good life is where you get an education or not, you get a good job, you make a lot of money, and maybe you get married and take care of your family. And there's nothing wrong with any of that, but it's a very limited perspective that's grounded in biopsychosocial roles, period. There are, two more ways at least two more ways to respond to that. One is the underworld response. The other is the upper world response. All three responses can be valid at the same time. But the American culture, the Western culture, the 21st century culture, any nation that's post-industrial, I don't care if you're living in Russia, if you're living in Ukraine, if you're living in Israel, if you're living in Gaza, if you're living wherever, most people respond through this middle world biopsychosocial sense of identity. And what we can do, maybe, I don't want to rush through the other two because we're close to the top here. That even wasn't enough of an explanation of that common response. But it's a big question, because you live differently if you think, okay, I'm this sack of bones and flesh and muscles and a brain, and I do this. My parents were this, my kids are this, my job is this, I have this much money, I'm this tall, I weigh this much, and I'm going to die. Okay? Nothing wrong with that, but it's very, very partial in terms of the human experience. And that's what Alan Watts was getting at. He's speaking about the idea that, the witness, the observer, the awareness itself is the identity that we cloak with all of the biopsychosocial stuff. But if you've never heard that before and you don't know what Alan Watts was talking about, that's mumbo jumbo to a lot of people, even though it could really be helpful. There it is. What am I missing? And so we were exploring who am I really? And we bumped into what I might be missing, which makes a lot of sense. Okay, I'll shut up.
Well, to your point, my pre thoughts before being exposed to Alan Watts, I began to start thinking that my identity was my purpose, and I still do believe to a certain extent that my identity is my purpose, because I remember hearing, I believe it was Dr. Wayne Dyer talked about that what's real is that which doesn't change.
Yeah.
So your physical body changes every 7 years. All your cells in your body die and replenish, and your looks actually looks different every 7 years. So that's you're not your body. That proves that you're not your race, because again, race is a construct, and we can prove that people like Sammy Sosa and other folks changed their race. Uh, you know, um, White supremacy also allows they've changed their definition of what's white throughout the years. Again, we can talk about how Irish wasn't considered white, Italian wasn't considered white, Jews wasn't considered white. If you look back in their 20s and 30s and 40s, so they're considered white now. So that's not real. You're not your job. That changes over the years. You're not any of these things that people choose to accept because that's what they're been taught, and then that voice in their head now adding Alan Watts to it. But prior to Alan Watts, I understood that for me, it was just my identity used to be my gender. That's my identity first when I was born. You're a black male. I mean, then it became my race. You're a male. Then it became my race. You're a black male. And I let that be my identity for years. And I was racially, that was my pride. And I stood on that until I got older and began to realize now it's my job. Now I'm a black engineer, and that became my identity. So it was still a race component plus my career. But now, through gaining wisdom, reading more information, learning, growing, it became my purpose, because that's, to me, is what doesn't change. That is to serve. It's to be a servant. How I serve changes throughout the years, but being a servant doesn't change. And so for me, that's what I believe prior to Alan Watts was my identity. And I get what you're saying. Most people would answer the question the way you said. They will answer based on the role they're most dominant in, or they have the most emotion around, or they currently operating. I'm a mother, or I'm a father, I'm a daughter, or I'm an attorney. They're going to identify by their professions. And I just really think that the growth that you, or the course that you were teaching with Kent about being fully human was so important. I wish I had taken the course, but I have taken it in so many ways by just working with you over the last 3 or 4 years. I've taken the course in that context, and the information you've turned me on to the point where Alan Watts, as you said, makes sense to me, where it wouldn't have made sense to me had I read Alan Watts 5 or 6 years ago prior to connecting with you and going through the life journey course I've gone through with you for the last couple of years.
Yeah. Maybe next week in the second half of the show we can do a little bit of what a lot of teachers, Alan Watts being one of them, refer to as self-inquiry, where you gradually ask some questions, and am I this? Am I that? Am I this? Am I that? And you actually did a little bit of that as you were talking about it, and you realize you're really not that. You're not your emotions. You're not your thoughts, and you finally get, okay, so what's left? But I want that's a practice, but we could actually do it like a 5 or 10 minute version of that next week if we want to, which might be a good way to bring next week's show to an end. But now, okay, you're in charge. What are we doing next?
Well, we're going a new format, so if people can see, we kind of little find our way as we do this. So give us some grace on that. Now, the way we did the previous shows, we would end with giving an example of someone who we felt was fully human. I still want to continue to go with that process. I think that's a good idea to show folks that we're not just talking about these pie in the sky type ideas, but people actually have lived this behavior style as well as continue to live these behavior styles. And for me, for a second week in a row, I'm still going to give my flowers to people who are adopting this philosophy and this mindset, who look at others as human beings. And that's really the most important part that I look at for being fully human, the importance of it. It's not just defining you as being fully human yourself, but seeing the humanity in others. And I think that's really the first path about being fully human, whether you articulate I'm a human, fully human or not, when you start seeing humanity in others, and then you can offer kindness and love and support to others, regardless of their race, skin color, geographical location, finances, etc. So I want to give my continued flowers to those individuals who see others as human beings and act accordingly with love and kindness.
Yeah, beautiful. So I'm going to mention somebody that I see as being fully human that I typically don't do this because I don't know this person. I've only been aware of this person for the last month or so. I heard her interviewed on a show that comes out of Connecticut Public Radio called Disrupted, hosted by a wonderful interviewer, Kalila Brown Dean. And she interviewed, I'll name the person I want to acknowledge, and I'm reading her book now based on the interview I heard. And her name is Vanessa Priya Daniel, or Daniels. I don't have it in front of me, so I apologize to you, Vanessa. God forbid you ever hear this. I don't know if it ends in an S or not. And her book is called Unrig the System. And then the subtitle is something like Lessons in Leadership from Women of Color, or what women of color have to teach leaders at all levels, something like that. So it's a specific focus on women of color. She's a woman of color. She worked in nonprofit sector for years. She created a fund and was the executive director of this fund that raised money for not-for-profits. She's a mom, blah, 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 blah. I'm not sure how old she is. I'm going to guess she's in her late 30s or early 40s, but she's in a lot of good work. But I want to just talk about her being fully human, because as I read, I was struck during the interview, and I was struck as I'm reading the book, and I'm only about 30 pages into the book. But she's very, very precise in her language, where she's really making it clear that this is a book that honors the plight of women of color who have grown into leadership positions over the years against great odds, because they had both the gender and the racial subjugation going against them, and how they're really struggling right now because there's a whole pushback against diversity, equity, inclusion, and everything. But what she does is she's very aware of who might read the book. In other words, she doesn't know who might read the book. And she says things like, I'm not saying that only women of color have these traits or can teach this, nor am I saying that all women of color have these traits. I'm saying that there's a disproportionate number of women of color because of what they had to go through to rise up to the place where they actually got to. So she constantly does that throughout the book, where she says, I'm not making a sweeping generalization that only women of color are good people. And she does it in a very eloquent way. She's a good writer as well. So I just want to, it's really refreshing, because a lot of people who are doing good work are unskillful in how they do it, in my estimation. And she seems to be very clear and very skillful in how she makes her arguments. I can't imagine a fragile white person reading this and being offended by it, as some, fragile white folks are, and even some fragile black folks, because she makes it clear that sometimes the problems that women of color who have risen up to be leaders, a lot of the pushback they get is from other women and other blacks, because they kind of resent the individual. So anyway, Vanessa Priya Daniels is the person I want to point to today.
All right, I'm gonna look her up. I hadn't ever heard of her, but I'm definitely look her up. And one last thing I want to add to that, I know we kind of went over time, but I just want to make this point. And that's why people got to realize at this stage in our lives, we got to stop living that false narrative of the racial construct. This video came on my YouTube feed yesterday of the young black girl, couldn't be older than about 23 or 24 years old. And someone else was playing her video. And what she was talking about, how she really, truly believes 90% of what Nick Fuentes says. The 10% she doesn't agree with is all his hateful rhetoric, she says. But she can agree with all his first American stuff. And my point, I mentioned her quickly, and maybe we can talk about folks like this in another show at another time. It's the fact that It just shows you that how someone can have a description, a physical description that equals mine as far as our skin color, if we go by that and judge people by that, which is why my point is why that's idiotic to do that. Because she believes in someone who is 90% opposed to her.
Yeah.
That's what she believes. So that shows you nowadays that it's not really so much about black, white. We get caught up in putting people in these categories based on a racial construct as though everybody is monolithic in that. And they're not. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I just wanted to add that little piece. That's why it's important, because you made a mention that black women would sometimes be her greatest enemies or her critics as she's writing what she's writing. And I'm just showing you that it doesn't really come down to the color. It really comes down to the mindset again and how people identify. And this girl defines herself as a black, Hispanic, gay American. That's what she got. So that just shows you when she identifies herself, she has those three opposing identities and they going on her head, and then says, I agree and support Nick Fuentes, and that's why he's growing. So it just shows you the disconnection there in her own mental framework of how she's living. But that's for another conversation. I just wanted to point that out. But again, as we wrap the show up, Reggie, thank you for another wonderful topic as we change the format of our show. Still getting our feet. By the third or fourth episode, we'll be exactly creating value for you all. So until next Wednesday, I want everybody to have and wish everybody, we both do, happy holidays, wonderful Thanksgiving, getting with your family, sharing that love. Hopefully keeping those politics to a minimum, because we know that they can be divisive. And until next Wednesday at 10 a.m., so I'll continue to strive to be more fully human. Thank you.